Hello, everybody. I'm a practicing therapist and a doctoral student of psychology. Today, I wanted to go over some of the ways you can tell if your partner or person that you are interested in is dismissive avoidant or fearful avoidant, or are they not interested? And I think this is something that a lot of people are curious about, and I think a lot of people deserve to know. But before we get into it, I do want to let y'all know that this is not a one size fits all. I don't want you guys to get too caught up in the semantics or any of the details that I'm saying and think because your partner fits one perspective or the other that it means that your partner is definitively not interested or that means they definitely are avoidant. It doesn't really work like that. This is just a general guide. You guys know your partners way better than I will ever know your partner, okay? Obviously. And so I hope that you guys can take this with a grain of salt while still learning as we go. So the very first one is actually the partnership dynamics. That's kind of how I want to label the first section. Avoidant individuals, they tend to not label the relationship, but it actually displays the characteristics of being a relationship, such as exclusivity, texting, affection, seeing their partner regularly or semi-regularly, or if they're not seeing you regularly, they're still talking to you very regularly. They are loyal. They are comfortable with you. However, they get triggered when it comes to the actual terminology of commitment. And as the relationship gets forward and connects more, their trigger decreases. And so they actually become more willing to commit as the relationship progresses. Very common with avoidant individuals. And most of you guys are actually with an avoidant just based on your comment. So you guys probably already know that. But for anybody who still wants to know, this is very helpful, okay? A person who is not interested and they're not a avoidant, they typically are very fine with verbally expressing love and commitment, but their actions actually show otherwise. So it's kind of the opposite of an avoidant. They actually tell you, hey, I am committed to you, or you are my girlfriend, or you are my boyfriend, or I love you, but they are breaking promises. They are in another relationship. Maybe they have a side partner, or you're the side partner, or they're married. They're ignoring you. They are telling you exactly what you want to hear, but showing you the opposite. And the avoidant individual is doing things, slowly progressing the relationship, but they are not labeling it. So very different, complete opposite, actually. But the reason why sometimes people mix it up is because you're not getting something from that person, right? For an avoidant individual, you're not getting confirmation. You're not getting that security because they're not saying it. In fact, sometimes they might say, we're not in a relationship, like we have nothing, and yet it's a relationship. So it's very confusing. And then when a person's not interested, they're saying we are in a relationship, but it doesn't feel like one. And so that's why people can get this mixed up. So I do understand. The next one is bedroom intimacy, okay? Dismissive avoidance, they do tend to have intimacy in the bedroom initially, but then it decreases as the feelings deepen. However, once the healing starts and the relationship progresses, intimacy returns gradually and actually becomes much more romantic, much more connected. So much more like holding hands, looking at each other in the eyes, being more gentle with the intimacy, having it more long lasting, not necessarily doing it just for physical release, but more like a romantic connection. Whereas a person who is not interested, their intimacy actually might be sporadic and it often lacks the emotional connection, or it seems very, very connecting in a very chemical type of way. It's very emotional. It's very lustful. It can be very romantic, but it tends to be more sporadic, more high intensity. Their engagement often revolves around that physical intimacy. So it tends to be they're showing interest more specifically around these moments. Whereas dismissive avoidance, they actually tend to show more interest or connection when you guys are just talking, when you guys are walking together, when you guys are cooking together. That's where dismissive avoidance tend to actually feel more of the romance, whereas a person who's not interested, they may not show any romance outside of the bedroom, if that makes sense, okay? The next one is actually relationship history. Now, this is not always the case for fearful avoidance, but for dismissive avoidance, they tend to have very short-term relationships or no relationships where they may have gaps of that romantic exposure. Now, fearful avoidance, what I've noticed with them is they may have relationships, but they may be very short-term. They could be very frequent, but they just tend to be very short term. So they tend to end before full commitment is done. Or what happens is, and this can happen with dismissive avoidance as well, but fearful avoidance, what sometimes happens is they may have been married and they may have actually leaned more anxious in that marriage. But what happened is that marriage broke. Maybe they were cheated on. Maybe they were hurt. And so what ends up happening is as the relationship is broken, they are out of the marriage and now they're leaning much more dismissive, right? Because fearful avoidants, they lean anxious or dismissive depending on their childhood, depending on their experiences throughout their adulthood as well, also who they're with in their relationship. So fearful avoidance can be very interesting with that particular perspective. However, you can see that. I hope that makes sense. That one's a little bit hard because fearful avoidance, depending on which side they lean, you can see one way or the other. But in individuals who are not interested, so they're not avoidant, but they're just not interested in you, they tend to have a mix of long-term and short-term relationships with minimal gaps. Right? Fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance, you can still see a pattern. With individuals who are not interested, there's not necessarily a clear-cut pattern. And I think that makes it important to recognize that if somebody is stringing you along and they don't have an attachment issue, there could be another way to communicate, but you're not going to be able to communicate with them the way you want to communicate with an avoidant, and it might not work. And then what happens is you might become very frustrated with the fact that they're not changing, they're not healing, and it's because they're not an avoidant. You're using techniques that might not apply, if that makes sense. That's why I think these videos are really helpful. The next one is their perception and perspective of change. Avoidant individuals, both dismissive and fearful, but much fearful avoidants are more willing to change. They just struggle with actually pinpointing where to change or what to change, and they can become very anxious. But dismissive avoidance, what happens is they actually resist change initially, but as the relationship connects, they actually build trust and they do start changing. And fearful avoidants do that as well. As soon as the anxiety and fear of the relationship starts dissipating or decreasing, they start changing as well. So both fearful and dismissive avoidants, they start changing as the relationship progresses. They start becoming more secure. Now, an individual who's not interested, they can make promises to change, but they actually don't follow through. And regardless of the depth or safety of the relationship, they just are not changing no matter what. And unfortunately, this is why people can get a little bit confused, because these individuals actually do say, I want to change or I will change, but they're not doing anything. And sometimes they're just saying that because they might feel it in the moment, but they might not be interested fully, or their interest might be divided. They might be married. So they might care about you, but they're married to someone else. They care about someone else as well. Their attention is divided. They're very conflicted. And that's not necessarily an attachment issue. That's more of a self-esteem issue. That's more of a self-confidence issue. That's more of a fear. It could be an attachment issue, but it's more of a fear of actually being alone, being abandoned sometimes. And so you might end up in this type of situation, or they might not be interested in you and they're using you for something, which I hope that's not happening. And that's not as common, but it does happen. And so that's why I wanted to make this video, to kind of clarify some of those aspects. There are plenty of these aspects, and I don't want anyone to feel like this means there's no hope for your relationship. I believe that most relationships have some sort of hope, but regardless, I think this is important to clarify what's going on. I hope this video was helpful to somebody. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.